don't get cheeky. And the Soviets treated their satellite nations in pretty much the same fashion. And so in that respect, we never really had much regard for democracy for anybody else. I mean, we overthrew a democracy in Guatemala in 1954 because the democratically elected president wasn't saying the kinds of things we thought that he should say. And so that's not the kind of democracy we ought to be about. I'm not for anybody in South Africa. I don't have to be. That's for South Africans to choose. If they choose de Klerk, it's fine with me. I won't be particularly happy, but it's their right to do so. I mean, this country chose Ronald Reagan. I stayed, I lived with it. Jesus. That's democracy. You accept the deal. People get the right to choose, and they do that. And so we ought to be behind these. During the Bush period, in Africa, we gave 4 times as much to tyranny as we gave to democracy. But you got a country like Botswana. Botswana has reserves. They've got a multi-party democracy. They've got an independent judiciary. They've got a free press. The country works. We've never given beans to Botswana. And we've given all this money to Zaire. It's a crime the way American money has been spent on tyranny in the third world and not been spent supporting democracy. And so we need to weigh in where countries are going in the right direction, respecting human rights, trying to move in a democratic direction. We need to make sure that this country is behind them, which is someplace we haven't been for the last 30 years. Yes?
Just moving on to that same question, just like in the White House right now, their most important issue right now is this North American free trade, and like we've invested in a lot of leaders and countries that are always supplying arms, like we talked about Somalia. When do you see the perspective of this year 2000 going on, when we're going to have a situation where America just...
Well, I think...
We will invest in America, or invest in Africa in the right way.
I think we're moving away from an arms policy, largely because the Cold War is over. Not for the right reasons, but I think we're moving away from it. For instance, Haiti's army sucks up 40% of the country's national resources. Haiti doesn't need an army. Who are they going to fight? I mean, the Haitian army is there to be used against the Haitian people. My wife is from St. Kitts. They got 40,000 people on her island in the Caribbean, and I saw a group of people marching down the street one Sunday, and they were singing "Armed with Christian Soldiers." I said, "Who are they?" She said, "That's the army." That's all the army they need. You don't need to spend your money in a developing country on guns. It's ridiculous that we should be doing that in countries, and the guns get used against their own people, with the exception of Tanzania's involvement to liberate Uganda. And the situation in the South, we have not had situations in Africa where any country invaded any other country to overthrow anything. So what are all these armies about? It's absurd to spend money in that kind of fashion. I think it's coming to an end. Now, on NAFTA, the problem that the labor unions have is understandable, in the sense that people who play the game from the top, who are well-heeled and run industries and are former presidents and that sort of thing, can tell us, and I think they're right, that there's a restructuring of the global economy, which means that thousands of certain kinds of jobs will be lost and thousands of other jobs will be created, because the world economic marketplace is in a state of flux and change. And you've got to get ahead of the curve if we expect to compete on even terms with the Europeans and the Pacific Rim countries. I understand. But the problem is the thousands of jobs that will be lost will affect the people that are in these labor unions. And the dislocation will have an immediate deleterious effect on tens of thousands of people who may not be the people retrained for the new jobs that are going to be created. Now, if I'm in one of those jobs, I wish the future well. But I'm worried more about how I'm going to feed my wife and my children next month and month after next. And if you can address that problem, maybe I would support NAFTA. But the people in labor unions don't see that problem addressed, and they feel immediately threatened by what NAFTA will mean early on. Caribbean countries are concerned in a different way. If a trade barrier drops for Mexico, that puts Jamaica and Trinidad and Barbados and those countries at an immediate and important, significant disadvantage. because it means that Mexican products can come here with no tariff, and the products from the Caribbean countries are still burdened with this kind of tariff. So they're saying that if you do this for Mexico, you must do it for the island nations in the hemisphere as well. And that may be the only way they get any support from the Congressional Black Caucus. And that doesn't guarantee the Congressional Black Caucus, because the labor unions are pressuring them on the other side. But to get any support, they will have to do this for the Caribbean as well. This can't pass without the nothing can pass without the Congressional Black Caucus. That's the good fortune of having 40 votes in the Congress. Nothing passes the House by a margin of larger than 40 votes, unless it's does apple pie taste good. So the caucus has enormous power now in the Congress. And that's why the President, the Secretary of State, and the Security Advisor and others attended the Congressional Black Caucus dinner this year. They've never gone before, and I don't think it's because they like the chicken. Yes?
That is entrenched throughout the bureaucracy of the State Department. And I just give an example. When I happened to be in a situation where I had just met the president of Benning South, was reporting back on some issues. I mean, there was laughter, well, and it was that. I mean, there's such a disdain. And it's the same thing when we're talking about the people from Papua New Guinea. When we were talking about the Treaty of Rarotonga in terms of what was happening, in terms of environmental issues to the children who were being born with brain malformations as a result of nuclear testing that France had done. And to his credit, Mitterrand made stronger commitments on these issues and acknowledged better, as did Helmut Kohl, their responsibility for their actions in Africa than we were willing to do. And the bureaucracy of the State Department is so, I mean, it is really, I mean, you get mad. You get really mad when you come up against the kind of racist attitude that I don't even think they see as racist.
I remember once they were having a meeting of the Democratic caucus in the House, and Stephen Solars, who was then a leading foreign policy member of the House and a leading liberal. Steve was one of them. He's now ambassador to India, was one of the most thoughtful, brightest members of the House who always did his homework. And they had been talking about the budget, and Steve said, now let's move from the sublime to the ridiculous. Let's talk about Zimbabwe. And they all laughed. Yuck, 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 yuck. Once they brought up the subject in the National Security Council of an African country, and General Haig, who was in the advisor to the president, started beating tom-tom beats out on the table. This stuff happens all the time in the Congress, and it's a major problem. You see, that's why I always say if you're going to influence policy, you have to be in the room. For instance, this debate that they're having on Senator Packwood, 2 years ago that would have been impossible. The Senate would never have taken up that question. They only take it up now because there's 7 women in the Senate. That's the only reason this is getting addressed in this way. The chemistry of the Senate has changed because women are in the Senate. When blacks are in the room, the discussion changes. Just the presence changes the discussion. It makes better people of us all. Now, there's nobody without some weakness for bigotry. I doubt if there's a person in this room who has never said a bigoted thing in the privacy of one's own little group. Tee-hee-hee, I hope I haven't been overheard, that sort of thing. Well, these things plant the seeds of disease in our society. And in our public places where major policy matters are being hammered out, this country ought to show itself with all the diversity that it is. For instance, in Washington, there's a movement started by Ben Nighthorse Campbell, the only Native American in the U.S. Senate, to rename the Washington Redskins. Now, The people in Washington, blacks and whites, who can't see what the problem is. They say, what is wrong with that? They're the Washington Redskins. Now, if they named them the Washington Blackskins, black folk would bust a gasket. And the point is that if it is offensive to Native Americans, case closed. It's offensive. It offends them. It doesn't offend y'all because y'all white folk and black folk. It offends them. Enough said. Rename the damn team. Don't understand it. But they don't seem to get it. And the only way they will get it is for somebody like Ben Nighthorse Campbell to embarrass and embarrass and embarrass and embarrass. And then finally, they get it. But you have to be in the room. There's nothing better than presence. And to be just relentless in standing up for the things that are right. In addition, I think this whole business of travel and sensitizing people, it is so wonderful. You will see the world in completely different terms when you spend time with people that you knew nothing about before. Culture shock, yes, good for you. And to take advantage of the African students that you have. I mean, so many of us think having African students on our campuses that we're doing them a favor. I mean, I don't know how many other foreign students you have here from other countries, but I see a good number of African students here tonight. It's a wonderful opportunity for people in Iowa to learn something about other cultures and places without paying TWA. And so there ought to be structured discussions with people about that because they can enrich the education process at Iowa State. Do we take advantage of it? Seldom. Yes. And then I'll come back here. Then you. Yes.
Trans-Africa found a specific moment in which to focus attention on the South African embassy and got a tremendous amount of attention behind the freedom struggle in South Africa at a moment where it really cost them money and it had an effect. Do you see anything going on right now where people can put specific pressure where something's happening?
Well, we are going to have an affair on Wednesday with President Aristide. You know, you can't do anything in this country without television. We're having a press conference with Aristide, and we're working on Southern Sudan, we're working on Zaire, we're working on a number of issues. The South Africa thing worked for several reasons. One, there was some place where we could get ourselves thrown in jail. We did it on a slow press day, which was the day before Thanksgiving in '84, and it got global coverage. And then we got 5,000 people thrown in jail, and then we were booking celebrities from Stevie Wonder to all the Kennedy children, and we had so many arrests because there's so many Kennedy children. And we were just putting people in jail, and because it was a media event. And everybody knows that television drives this society, and we were able to manipulate media to do it. You can't do it on other issues. Frankly, American media are interested in those parts of Africa where there are white people. And so there's been more coverage of South Africa and Zimbabwe than any other place in Africa. I mean, anything could happen in a place like Gabon and you couldn't get a footnote in the New York Times. It's sad. And so you sit around and think of ways that you can invent media because you know you need it to drive your issue. Not only do we do it, everybody does it. The Right to Life people, these people, that. You just sit around and say, what foolish stunt can we put on this week to catapult this thing? Because it drives the Congress. They watch CNN just like everybody else, and they decide what's important, what's not important, what they can pay attention to, and what they can ignore from what they see on television. And Americans watch more and read less. Our newspapers are dying. USA Today has had great impact even on other newspapers. Even the Wall Street Journal has shortened its stories in response to McPaper, USA Today. It's a sad thing that's happening in American journalism. Most of us are getting our information from television. And if you get 2 minutes per issue, that's big coverage of an issue in a television newscast. And so we've studied ways of completing our stupidity, and we are well along in it. And the sad thing is that I don't know how much of the gauntlet have been taken up by universities. For instance, one might ask here at Iowa State, I know at most places you can start from grade school and go all the way through a PhD program and not learn anything about any part of the world outside of the US and Europe. And I would suppose you could do that here. A member of Congress told me he didn't think there were 20 members of Congress who could name 5 African countries. Now that's pretty heady duncehood there. You had a question. Can you speak louder, please?
I want to make a comment about your mentioning of the ignorance of
The what?
American people.
Yes.
I was happy when I see some distinguished politicians say civilized society, civilized people. I don't know who is not civilized in the first place, and who is civilized. Because from Africa, I think I'm civilized. Now, whether the Western civilization is better or greater than African civilization is something to discuss. But I am civilized. I don't consider myself as civilized. And when the Europeans went to us, they committed barbaric acts. They didn't commit anything that they are civilized, and they kept civilized. This is my first point. Second point is, no later than this afternoon, I checked out a book from the library. And when I was a kid, I'm from Chad, for the record. When I was a kid, I learned in school that the guy who tried to defend the borders of the kingdom that was there, the Kanem-Borno kingdom, that is actually part of Chad now, died, and he was, depicted in the history books as him, as ruthless and used all kinds of violence, and that's the answer to the same part. And there is, like these books, people read the books, and if they come across this book, that is, do not reinforce the ignorance about other people, other nations, other religions, as mentioned. How can we do? Because these books are still in circulation, and they are part of this ignorance, and the perpetuation of ignorance. So, I think we need to recall this book, because for me, Rami Abdullah was a hero. He fought the French, we dealt all the arsenal for 3 years. And he died, he was a hero for me. But that one I discovered later on by doing my own research, and also by the effort of some African scholars who tried to rehabilitate our leaders who fell in the line of duty fighting against the colonialists. So the kind of literature that we still have in libraries are destructive.
You know, the Nazi publicist Goebbels said that if you tell a lie enough times, it becomes the truth. There's a certain truth to that. And some things we've accepted in our lexicon, we go on without thought globally. I'm always so troubled when I hear people refer to tribes. Even Africans say tribes. But we never hear the Serbs called a tribe. We never hear the Croatians called a tribe, or the Catholics or the Protestants of Northern Ireland, or the Georgians of Soviet Georgia. I mean, we never hear this. We hear about African dialects. I think we're the only people in the world who speak dialects. Everybody else has languages. We can walk around in hot weather, scantily clad, and it's primitive. American women can go around the beaches with strings tied through them. And in a very painful looking display, but it's quite proper. We wear the decoration in our nose. American women wear it in their ears. One is primitive, the other is just fine. It's such a silly kind of cultural chauvinism. But I often wondered when I heard so much about Margaret Mead as a child, why didn't she stay at home and study the people in the Bronx? Why did she have to spend a whole life in the Pacific telling other people why they are or are not primitive? I mean, everybody has cultural traditions, no less worthy than anyone else's. Why do we do these things that feed our own sense of superiority? And we do it to such an extent that we don't even reflect on it anymore. And so I must tell you, as an African American, I must confess this smallness, that after the Cold War and the Soviet Empire collapsed, to see white folk throughout Europe behaving so savagely towards one another gave me a certain sense of redemption. I said, well, will you look at this? Yes. Well, no, I think Nigeria probably, number one, made a mistake when it designed a constitution that was just like this one in one of its many democratic experiments. Number one, African countries have to design democratic systems that are suitable for those countries and societies. This is a homogeneous, relatively culturally homogeneous society. Americans pretty much, by and large, have the same religion and the same language. Although with racial differences, of course, it still is a cultural melting pot in some other ways because it has electronic media that have homogenized this country. So that when you eat the Big Mac in California, you know it's the same Big Mac you're going to have in Tampa. It has a certain uniformity to it, which is sometimes deadening to the senses, but it gives a society the kind of stability that you've seen here. Also, this country's had 200 years of democratic experience. Most Americans take it for granted, and that's why many don't vote anymore, but nobody talks about overthrowing the government in this country. And when people live in productive, wealthy societies, they don't want to overthrow the government because the status quo is just nice. You keep people well fed and keep them in a house with 2 bedrooms and a driveway, you don't have to worry about a revolution. It doesn't make any difference what kind of government you got, you don't worry too much about revolution in those cases. Now, Nigeria has a completely different situation. Number one, the Berlin Conference screwed up Africa because Europeans came in, dominated the continent, cut it up into pieces that made no sense, drew lines through language groups, arbitrarily created countries that don't make any sense. Did the same thing in the 1930s in the Middle East. And when we talk about Iraq, Bahrain, Kuwait, all that, those guys, Sir Percy Cox, a British lord, sat in the desert in a tent one night, had a stick in the sand, and created these countries. And so this business, about Saddam Hussein going to war over Kuwait and all that sort of stuff, the border dispute between Kuwait and Iraq predates Saddam Hussein, goes back to the 1920s, because arbitrary country making performed on this part of the world by Europeans. Same thing happened in Africa between the French, the British, the Belgians, on and on and on, and carved up the country. Nigeria has 200 languages. It has 3 major language groups. And then it has 2 major religions. And so you've got all of these things boiling around in the same pot. And you have to, in any system in a country like that, establish a kind of balance between the groups so that suspicions don't develop in the period of confidence building in a democracy in its nascent stages. And so it takes time. There are going to be starts and failures and that sort of thing. But I think Nigeria can do it. But I don't think it can do it mimicking the West. Nigerians have to decide. I thought that, for instance, in Kenya, when the Forum for the Restoration of Democracy made a mistake in going into the elections without thinking about something that's more important in democracy than elections. Democracy is not about elections. Elections are one expression of democracy. Democracy is about the cultivation of a culture of tolerance and forbearance and patience and civility and all of that. They wanted to run against Arap Moi because they wanted to power, and it didn't seem to me that they had enough discussion about what kind of Kenya they wanted, which was more important than the elections. And so the question is, what kind of Nigeria do we want? Now, it seems to me that if Nigeria doesn't recognize Abiola as the president, Nigeria is headed down the road to civil war. He won the election, and he won it fairly. And he is a Muslim, with a Muslim running mate, won it in Christian areas too. He won it across ethnic lines, he won it across religious lines. And so Babangida has not served Nigeria well. He has stolen half of it. He suppressed the other half. And now he probably has an inordinate influence through the puppet now in place. And as you know, 1 out of every 4 or 5 sub-Saharan Africans is a Nigerian. It's the most important country as a kind of power beacon, bellwether in Africa. And God help us if Nigeria can't sort out its problems. But I don't think anybody can do that for Nigeria. Nigerians have to do that. And then we have to get on the right side of the issue to give Nigerians the support they need to complete that task. I think that, may I take one last question?
One last question.
Last question here. Yes, you, sir.
What is the role, what do you consider the role of World Bank and IMF in Africa?
The role of the IMF. Well, the problem with the IMF is that the IMF administers the same bitter medicine to all developing countries. It tailors no loans to anybody, structural adjustment, and all of that. You can see this nasty brew at work in a place like Zambia, for instance, where somebody like Chiluba, Frederick Chiluba, who is the leader of labor unions, he comes to power democratically. He wins an election against the father of the country, Kenneth Kaunda. And then he goes through the process of the provincial elections. But then he's told by the IMF, you've got to do structural adjustment at the same time. Now, we expect African countries to do what we're not prepared to do in this country. Walter Mondale says to Americans during the campaign, I'm going to have to raise taxes. And we say to Walter, and you ain't going to be president either. So Americans force politicians to lie to us because we don't want to hear the truth. Presidents get too much credit for stuff they got nothing to do with and too much blame for stuff they got nothing to do with. You know, conservatives are right about one thing. Countries and economies run just like you do your household budget. You want to buy more stuff than you got money to buy. And so what you have to sell are your goods and your services. If the goods and the services you produce with the medium of money as a medium of exchange come up short in terms of what you want to buy, you got a deficit, you got to borrow to cover the difference, and then you got to do debt service on what you borrowed. And so if you got to cut back on that, most Americans don't want to hear it. And so our own economy has run down and down and down and down. We're saving less and spending more, and we're no longer competitive in the world marketplace. But we really don't want a president to give us the bitter medicine. The IMF does that to countries with no margin at all. So Chalupa comes to power, he accepts the IMF formula, devalues the currency. The price of maize, staple food, shoots up 1,000%. He is hit by 56 strikes in his first 9 months in office from the very unions he used to lead. Now you're going to these people asking them for votes when they can't buy food because you have accepted the IMF policies. It does not work. You cannot have a situation that causes poor countries to put their books in order at the expense of people. And that's what the IMF does to countries. And if they say to you, if you want the money, these are the terms. And because the IMF is controlled by a handful of countries, you accept the deal or you don't. And I think it's heartless. And I think the IMF ought to find a way to tailor its policies more nearly to these situations in these countries to cause them less pain as they try to move their economies towards viability in a sensible way. And I don't think they are doing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Your Honor.